Today on Uncommon Knowledge, the United States and Europe, from the Cold War to the Big Chill.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, what to do about those Europeans. For 45 years, the threat of conflict with the Soviet Union brought the United States and Western Europe into a tight and enduring partnership, most notably represented by the NATO military alliance. Today, the Soviet Union is gone, and the European Union is on the road to possible superpower status in its own right. Does that transatlantic alliance have a future? Joining us, three guests. Coit Blacker is director of the Stanford Institute of International Studies. Josef Joffe is editor of Die Zeit, the German news magazine. And Niall Ferguson is a professor of history at Harvard and the author of Colossus, The Price of America's Empire. Big document, sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations. You sat on the panel, actually, that put it together. It is called Renewing the Atlantic Partnership. I quote, "The Cold War is over, but cooperation across the Atlantic will remain critical for addressing the regional and increasing global challenges likely to be central in the 21st century. Cooperation across the Atlantic is likely to remain critical." My question is, why? And I don't mean to put that facetiously. Truly, why? In some situations, the Europeans are helpful, Afghanistan. In some Europeans are helpful while others are obstructionist, Iraq. In others, Europeans are irrelevant, North Korea. Why should the United States struggle to renew the Atlantic Partnership instead of simply putting together ad hoc coalitions, one foreign policy problem at a time? You were on the panel, you defend its work.
First of all, we no longer have a European and American economy, we have an Atlantic economy. And that fuses us together by hundreds of thousands of jobs, zillions of trade going back and forth. And we have a common market. So that can't be.
We are overwhelmingly each other's largest trading partner.
Correct. And so once you have a common market, you can't just do stuff ad hoc. And you see it all the time, you know, with cartel and antitrust law and stuff like that. Hormone beef, you name it. So that's one real big one. The other real big one is, it's very hard for me to come up with issues in the United States that are very important for the United States that the United States can deal with on its own. Take Iran. If you want to keep nukes out of the hands of the Iranians, you've got to have the steady cooperation of the Europeans. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
You go with action?
I think what's interesting about this is that it is less self-evident to informed publics in the U.S. and in Europe that were married at the hip. That's
economically.
Well, kind of in all senses, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So
because of? That's rather than in spite of?
We are less aware of the ties that bind because this great mobilizing force is gone. But Neil, the links are still there.
Let me add, Robert Kagan, now famous for his article on Europe and the United States, argues that there are a couple of fundamental reasons for the divide, political divide, cultural divide, between the United States and Europe. One is that the United States is strong and Europe is weak. I'm quoting Kagan. "Europe's military weakness has produced a perfectly understandable aversion to the exercise of military power. They, the Europeans, hope to constrain American power without wielding power themselves." Close quote. Now, if that's true, you may disagree with it if you wish, but if that's true, if the European goal is to constrain American power, why should America cooperate in any way in that project?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't take it as self-evident that there should be harmonious transatlantic relations. It's extremely important that we should distinguish my position from your other two guests. It seems to me that...
You can always count on Niall Ferguson to pick up a handful of sand and throw it right in the gears.
That's what we're here for. It's, of course, something which everybody feels nostalgic about who grew up during the Cold War, and we are rather used to the idea that we should be able to shuttle back and forth across the Atlantic between London and New York, and we do, and we expect there to be harmony of a more general kind prevailing. But of course, as Chip rightly said, since the end of the Cold War, the rationale for Europe to subordinate itself to the United States, particularly in security matters, has completely gone. There is no longer a threat which the Europeans regard as significantly serious enough to justify that kind of subordination. And particularly, Peter, the Europeans do not see radical Islam as a commensurate threat. And as long as that's the case, as long as Europeans simply don't see terrorism as a fundamental threat, they won't play ball.
Let's explore the impact of the end of the Cold War on U.S.-European relations. Is it the fundamental psychology here of what's going on that after those 5 decades of the Cold War in which the United States really ran the show through NATO, of course we're consulting here, there, and everywhere, but the troops were ours, the missiles were ours, and so forth, the Europeans are just sick of it. They simply want to stand up. No?
No. Look,
That hasn't bred 5 decades of pent-up resentment.
Let's not put it in pathological or psychological terms. Let's put it in structural terms. The Great Watershed, of course, was the suicide of the Soviet Union, which had enormous consequences on both sides of the ocean.
Right.
The Europeans no longer depended for their strategic security on the United States, but interestingly enough, the United States no longer depended for its security, not on European armies, but on the strategic real estate that Europe represented. So the United States was also willing to pay rent, as it were, for that strategic real estate, as the Europeans were willing to pay fealty to the United States for security. Now that's gone.
That's just
It's a tremendous structural change in the relationship, and that explains a lot of our problems. Nonetheless, I would disagree with Neil to say, well, we don't have to care about good, nice transatlantic relationships. Who else do we want to hang out with?
I think we'll certainly try to preserve them, but I'm pessimistic. I don't see any obvious reason why the European Union should play second fiddle, as it did during the Cold War, to the United States. And the other key point that I'd like to make, actually, which is really very, very important here, is that Americans tend to assume it's a fundamental change in the United States that has caused a deterioration in transatlantic relations. In particular, there's an assumption that the Bush administration...
The Bush administration?
Right. The Bush administration, Peter, is the problem, and that it's a fundamental change in American foreign policy that has caused a deterioration in transatlantic relations. And I think this is fundamentally wrong. The real changes, apart from the end of the Cold War, are within Europe itself. Europe has changed much, much more profoundly in the past decade than the United States.
What about this Kagan suggestion that it really is a fundamental part of the European project now to constrain the United States, to tie down the giant Gulliver with thousands of threads?
No.
Is that fundamental to the European project?
No, I don't think it is fundamental to the European project. I think the fundamental goal set or group of ambitions within Europe are to define what Europe is becoming, so that it's much more self-referential than that comment implies. I don't think in Brussels, European heads of state come together to conspire about how best to constrain the United States.
They need to conspire because it comes so naturally.
It's not about that.
I disagree with them, though I'm going to speak from the Euro weenie point of view. If I were a real Euro weenie and I saw this Gulliver who had suddenly lost his ropes, aka Soviet countervailing power, and I watched this now liberated giant throw his weight around, which he has done, launching 2 wars in the last couple of years.
It makes you nervous.
It makes me nervous. It's like, the U.S. is not, even if I were a Euro weenie, the U.S. is not a T-Rex, but it's a very big elephant. And I want to keep some ropes on him because even if he is benign, he does trample the grass, doesn't he?
Let's get to Neil. Next, the European divide over the war in Iraq. Again, let me quote, Joe, that report, Renewing the Atlantic Partnership. Quote, "The war in Iraq brought the strains between the United States and Europe to the point of crisis, self-evident. France and Germany organized resistance to the United States in the UN Security Council alongside Russia, historically NATO's chief adversary," close quote. Joe, why did Germany side with its ancient adversary, Russia, against its close ally, the United States, over the war in Iraq?
Well, our ancient adversary is such an adversary no longer. After all, we've gotten what we want, right? We've gotten reunification, we've gotten the withdrawal of Soviet or Russian power from the heart of Europe, and we now have a Russia that has been weakened, maybe at the weakest point in the last century. So he no longer is a threat. And so this new kind of balancing game against American power can begin by the secondary powers who are suspicious of this vast unliberated power of the United States.
All right. So part of it is sheer power politics.
Yeah.
But what about all this, also the difference in perception? Go ahead and elucidate the point you were making about the difference in perception of radical Islam.
Well, I think although there was a brief moment after 9/11 when Europeans said we're all Americans now and we're all on the same side, that moment passed astonishingly quickly. And of course, the intervention in Iraq made it disappear because Europeans refused en masse to believe that there was any meaningful connection between a war against radical Islam and the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime. And I think on a whole range of grounds, Europeans can claim justly today to have been right. I mean, on weapons of mass destruction, on the links to Al-Qaeda, that the case made by the Bush administration for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was a very weak one, and it did not persuade Europeans.
There was a point early on when it seemed to this layman, question for you, Chip, that Europe thought, well, there is a radical Islam, and it is a problem, but what they're after is the United States. We're insulated. They're not after us. Can they still believe that after the attacks in Spain?
I think part of the reason why there is a clear discrepancy between how Americans regard the world and how dangerous it is, and our European allies, is because in Europe there has been nothing truly comparable to the attacks on September 11th. Were that to happen in Berlin or in London or in Paris or in Rome, then I think...
Even those, why did the attacks in Spain not do the trick? So
because frankly, they were not as horrific as the attacks on the World Trade Center.
No,
I think visually this stuff is terribly important. I know as a proportion of the population, it was a terrible loss for Spain. But if you say 3,000 people, and we first thought 6,000 or 9,000 with the capacity for 50,000, it's very, very different from an explosion in a train station.
Joe.
I just would like to disagree and amend this thing. For the Europeans like the Spaniards, even if they had not killed 250, but maybe 2,500, there's always the option of opting out. You can always say, look, the primary target is the United States, and I can save myself by distancing myself from the target. So it may be a heinous, but it's a rational response to then think out of the coalition as the Spaniards have done. The point is the Spaniards or the French or the Germans, whoever might be attacked next, have that option, which the United States does not have. So there's a built-in propitiatory or even appeasement reflex.
Can I add something to that? I agree with that, Joseph. I think there's also a tradition of appeasing terrorists in Europe that's now quite well established. Confronted with terrorist threats from the far left, and radical nationalist minorities, European governments, including, I'm afraid to see, even the Thatcher government in the 1980s, tended, in fact, to appease rather than to go to war. The IRA was essentially conciliated. There was some coercion, but the IRA was not in the IRA has practically got what it wants in Northern Ireland. The extent to which the IRA was appeased is constantly underestimated.
I disagree. May I disagree one sentence? I think we have normally been quite harsh with our domestic terrorists. The Germans with the Baader-Meinhof, the Italians with the Brigata Rossa.
Nobody's rougher than the French police.
The Spaniards with ETA.
Jerry Adams is now an elected representative.
I just gave you the other one. Let me just say, don't mess up my general profound pattern with a little puny exception.
The IRA was successful American-funded organization.
Quiet now. You've noted the exception.
No, we have to draw a distinction. I think every single European government has been extremely tough with its domestic terrorists. Ruthless almost. Where I think he's right, where at least where I would agree, is when it came to Arab, Iranian, etc. terrorism. That's where the propitiatory response kicked in. And I think the unspoken signal was, look, if you leave us, the Europeans, alone, we'll leave you alone.
My argument is there may come a time, and I think there will come a time, when this argument, we'll leave you alone, you leave us alone, is going to be falsifiable. It isn't going to work. And when there's a catastrophic incident in Europe, which I think there will be.
European opinion will change?
I'm not
overnight.
No, it's not going to change overnight, but it will change. It will shift. And this...
No, the United States will be blamed. I think you're underestimating how the Europeans would react.
So what will it take to get European support for America's policy in the Middle East? Can we And if so, how do we persuade the Europeans to join in this large project of transforming the political culture of the Middle East? You shake your head. We can't do it?
It's going to be very hard. I can't quite see how you drag the Europeans in. The only thing I can say is that they may do things short of military engagement, which they're doing already. They're training police and troops, etc.
What about the success in Iraq?
But
Does that
they
change
do
European
not-
attitudes?
If the United
in Afghanistan? The election?
I don't think, I think they kind of pass without notice. If the United States were to really pull this off in Iraq, by pulling off, I mean, stability, peace, and some kind of march towards democracy, then the picture will change. But let's not forget one basic thing, a structural thing, and I'll finish there. There is rivalry between Europe and the United States and the Middle East. There's rivalry over influence. And one reason why the Europeans are lining up with the Arabs and against Israel is because the United States has lined up with Israel and against some Arabs, so it's a competitive game.
The best way the United States can persuade the Europeans to join the large project is to succeed in Iraq.
No, because it's not enough. The Europeans have their own project for the Middle East, and it's called enlargement. Remember, negotiations are now underway for Turkish accession into the European Union. And if that happens within a very short space of time, Turkey would be the biggest, in terms of population, member of the European Union, bigger even than Germany. That is the key thing to watch, because that means, conceivably, the European Union's borders will be common to those of Iraq within the foreseeable future, not to mention Iran. So I think one has to recognize that there is a European project for the Middle East, and it is completely the antithesis of Bush's project for the Middle East. Not forcible democratization, but in fact a subtle democratization by offering membership of the EU as the bait, and the Turks have taken that bait.
But you're not suggesting they'd offer the bait to Egypt or to Libya, that the European Union would extend across?
Look, the European Union grew by 23% in territorial extent this year without firing a shot. Who says it should stop?
So in the backs of their minds in Brussels, they have that idea?
In the backs of their minds in North Africa and the Middle East, they very clearly have that in mind. And the other point to remember, Peter, is migration. Do not forget that something like 8% of the population of France is now Muslim, and the populations are rising for demographic reasons all over Europe. That is another key reason why European countries are not going to support American policy, whatever you do.
The most important thing that has been said, I mean, very, very many important things, and very elegantly said. The most important
Why else
thing
would I convene the three of you?
that's been said was Joe's first observation when he said it's structural. And
I didn't think that was important. I think that was boring.
I thought so that makes it 3-1 against. You're outvoted, Ferguson. Carry on, Chip.
And it will be about management. It will be about the management of differences. It will even be about the management of kind of complementarity. And it's going to be awkward.
They have their project, we have ours, and all we can do is work around the edges to try to keep open hostility from breaking out.
I think this project notion is terribly important, and that's partly what I meant earlier when I said that the Europeans are so self-referential in terms of what they're doing that I am not convinced that they sit around in Brussels and contemplate
second question, if you're thinking, if you're Condi Rice, your friend Condi Rice, thinking these things through. So, all right, this huge project of transforming the culture of the Middle East, we have our project, they have theirs. Second question, what about the nuts and bolts of the war on terror? Going after Al-Qaeda, are they cooperating in Europe as fully as they are?
Yes.
So that's not a problem.
No.
We're sharing intelligence.
That was an untold, the most untold story around these days, because in part also because the Europeans, not wanting to become targets, don't want to trumpet it. But as we speak here, for instance, there's American customs agents in the port of Hamburg, my hometown, collaborating with a German customs colleague in checking container-bound traffic for the United States. So that kind of stuff, the police, the customs works very nicely.
Now, advice for the European leadership.
There's an argument to be made that the German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, started the trouble by campaigning for re-election on an openly anti-American platform. What line of advice, television time, so we have to compress it into a line or two, would you give to Schröder about relations between Europe and the United States, Joe?
You can't screw around with the largest power in history forever. It is not a useful thing for a middle power to do.
You concur?
Well, Schroeder is nearly history anyway, so in a way, he played his card, he stayed the execution, but politically he is dead. And it's important to remember the political vulnerability of European leaders, who we take for granted.
For anti-Americanism?
Well, no, he's not. But it hasn't saved his political bacon. But I think Chip's point about the internal, introverted character of European politics is terribly important. Maybe that was the most important thing that was said, because Europeans are really much more interested in... It's not a structural matter, it's about personalities and it's about politics.
It's personality structure.
Chirac, Schroeder, these people are politically tremendously vulnerable for domestic political reasons. They will not be around for much longer politically. And I think Americans forget this.
Prime Minister Tony Blair. He's paid a price for sticking up with the United States, has he not?
Well, no, actually. He may be less popular than he was, but he's still securely in power and quite conceivably going to secure another term in office because there is no opposition. There is no opposition.
Tossed out a year's worth of The Economist magazine by saying he's paid no price.
I would like to toss out more than that of The Economist magazine.
There,
After all, they endorsed Kerry.
Yes.
Let's not forget that. But
your advice for Tony Blair as regards Europe and the United States?
Well, he should continue doing what he's brilliantly done so far, which is to play both ends against the middle, to be the bridge.
Who's the middle?
Britain is the middle. Britain is the middle.
To play both ends against itself?
The English expression implies that you play both ends in the game to your own advantage as the player in the middle. That is what Blair has rather brilliantly done. That is why he's going to outlast both Chirac and Schroeder.
What would you say to Chirac?
I'd say the same thing to him as to Schroeder, but he would laugh me out of court because he says, look, I can engage in my splendid anti-Americanism and get lots of applause at home, and I never get punished by the United States.
Should the United States seek to punish him in one way or another?
Very hard for a large power like the United States to do that to medium and small powers. Very hard. How would you do it? Would you bomb the Eiffel Tower? Would you forbid port visits in Norfolk for the French fleet? They don't have a fleet to begin with. How do you get
the only practical
like
step
that?
Is to ban French wine at the White House.
But you actually can't in any meaningful way do those sorts of economic measures because when it comes to trade, the European Union is an equal of the United States. So the United States can't reward its friends in the case of Britain, and it can't punish its enemies economically.
The big one, of course. Finally, advice for President George W. Bush in his second term. My advice would be something along the lines of, look very carefully at who was with you and who was against you in Europe. There is what Don Rumsfeld called the old Europe, and it centers on Germany and France and Belgium, but the periphery, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Britain, all to varying degrees supported. Spain has dropped out of the coalition, but you've got another party in Spain which still favors the United States. So the notion here is, to some extent, politely cherry pick. Establish deeper relations with the nations that are friendly toward us. Wonderful, don't you think, Chip?
Way too subtle for the United States.
Oh.
Way too subtle.
The United States can't play the balance of power game.
No. We can play the balance of power game when the number of actors is relatively modest. It's just extremely hard in American foreign policy, given the nature of the American system, to have that kind of a finely tuned, extremely subtle foreign policy. It's just very, very hard to do.
Okay, let's go around the table then. Give me your advice for George W. Bush over his next 4 years.
My advice would be tone it down a bit.
The rhetoric.
I think the rhetoric is unnecessary. I think it's polarizing. At the end of the day, it's not how to influence events around the world the way we want to.
So tone down the rhetoric and what else?
I think he should take advantage of the fact that he does have a second term to talk about what the world's architecture should look like. He's been very driven by a very narrow set of issues. And he should take advantage of the fact that he's got 4 more years to contextualize the war on terror, to contextualize all the changes.
He truly has a chance to do what his father talked about, which is to establish
a new world order. I think that's right. Yes.
Joe?
I would say, Mr. President, read in the life of your greatest predecessor in this century, namely a Republican president by the name of Ronald Reagan, who started his first term as a kind of evil empire killer, obsessive evil empire killer, enemy of communism to the max, and had his second term as a kind of disarmament guru, as a friend of Gorby, embraced and flattered Gorby, and in that way brought down the evil empire peacefully without a shot being fired. Now read that and then apply these lessons which have to do with flexibilities, being able to change ideology when the reality so demands, and still get American business done. The way to get things done is not to kick somebody else's shin, right? If I want something from you, I will not confront and affront you, but I'll try to find your interest and my interest and see how, in the give and take, I can come out ahead. That's realpolitik in personal as well as international life. And these guys haven't understood how that game works. They are idiots in diplomacy.
The Bush administration.
The Bushes.
Neil?
Well, I think the French have been equally idiotic in diplomacy, and I think I would say to...
Thank you. I feel much better hearing someone at this table say that.
I would say to President Bush, Mr. President, they despise you, they treat you with contempt. Do not expect anything from them. Do not expect, as of course Senator Kerry did expect, assistance in Iraq. And do not regard them as, in any sense, your allies when it comes to the Middle East. Be a realist.
Coit Blacker, Josef Joffe, Niall Ferguson, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thank you for joining us.
We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.